For decades, the most celebrated engineers on Earth, the most sophisticated investors on Wall Street, and the most decorated executives in the technology industry all committed the exact same fatal error when they examined the Xerox Corporation. They saw the most generously funded, most brilliantly staffed research laboratory ever assembled by any private company in the history of modern civilization, and they concluded that the empire built atop it was invincible. They believed that the organization, which had already conceived every foundational element of the personal computing revolution before the revolution itself had even begun, could never be outmaneuvered by a band of desperate, half-educated disruptors operating out of a California suburb. They were catastrophically, historically, and irrevocably wrong. The executives at Xerox's Rochester headquarters watched the technology landscape with the slow, sovereign gaze of a predator that does not yet realize it has already been swallowed. They had constructed the Palo Alto Research Center, a monument to human ingenuity, staffed by the most visionary computer scientists alive, and then proceeded to do something that defies every rational principle of corporate strategy. They opened the doors. They invited a hungry, 24-year-old predator named Steve Jobs into the inner sanctum of their most sacred technological secrets, extended him a guided tour of the future they had already built, and watched, in slow paralytic disbelief, as he transformed every one of those secrets into the foundation of the most valuable corporation the modern world has ever produced. Xerox had invented the future. Apple stole it, and the transaction was entirely, devastatingly legal. Any other startup in 1979 would have been turned away from the gates. Any other founder would have been refused access to proprietary research of that magnitude. The technology housed inside Xerox PARC, the graphical interface, the mouse, the laser printer, the networked workstation, should have been sealed behind contractual walls so impenetrable that no competitor could approach, let alone absorb, its contents. The commercial potential of those inventions was immeasurable. The scientists who built them understood it. Their own executives, catastrophically, did not. But instead of a fortress, Jobs found an open door, purchased for the audacious price of $1 million and a moment of institutional blindness. And rather than retreating in gratitude, he did the unthinkable. He walked through that door, memorized everything behind it, and spent the next decade converting it into the architecture of a civilization-altering empire. This is the story of how Apple executed the most audacious, legally irreproachable act of corporate appropriation in the history of technology. How a 5-year-old startup traded a pre-IPO investment for the intellectual inheritance of a research program worth hundreds of millions. How a company that had already built the future chose, with stunning consistency, to bury it. And how the ghost of every invention Xerox refused to deploy became the engine of a $3.77 trillion empire that now sits, sovereign and untouchable, atop the ruins of everything it plundered. To understand the absolute depth of this catastrophe, we must rewind to 1970, to a moment that corporate mythology has systematically erased from the public record. In that year, Xerox Corporation was not merely a successful company. It was a financial colossus, a sovereign entity holding near total dominance over the global document reproduction market. Its plain paper copier had transformed every office, every government bureau, every law firm on Earth. Its profit margins were obscene, its leadership was gilded, and its executives, intoxicated by the narcotic certainty of permanent dominance, made the decision that seemed, at the time, like an act of corporate enlightenment. They would build the greatest privately funded research laboratory the world had ever seen. They called it the Palo Alto Research Center. History would eventually call it the greatest act of institutional self-destruction in the annals of the technology industry. Because what the scientists at PARC constructed in the early 1970s was nothing less than the entire architecture of the modern digital world. By 1973, they had built the Alto, a machine so conceptually advanced that it would not be surpassed by any commercial product for more than a decade. The Alto ran on a bitmapped graphical display. It was driven by a small handheld device called a mouse. It used overlapping windows and clickable icons to navigate its operating environment. It connected to other machines via a local area network that PARC had coined Ethernet. It produced documents through a laser printer that PARC had also invented, in-house, from first principles. The Alto was the future, already functional, already elegant, already operational, and it was gathering institutional dust inside a laboratory whose parent company could not conceive of a commercial reason to release it into the world. Their ultimate weapon was something entirely invisible, and it was not the technology. The researchers at PARC possessed it with desperate clarity. The engineer Adele Goldberg understood it so viscerally that she personally opposed, with fierce and documented resistance, granting Apple's delegation access to the PARC demonstrations in December of 1979. She warned. She predicted, with extraordinary accuracy, what would happen. And the executives in Rochester overruled her, because their true competitive advantage, the mechanism that had made Xerox an empire, was also the mechanism that would destroy it, an absolute cultural certainty that they were a copier company. The so-called toner head mentality was so deeply embedded in the corporate architecture that it functioned as an active suppression system against any technology that could not be expressed in paper and ink. They had built the future and then locked it in a cage, because the future did not move toner. And into that cage, in December of 1979, walked Steve Jobs. The transaction he engineered to gain entry reveals, with extraordinary economy, the predatory intelligence that defined every competitive move he ever made. Apple was not yet public. Jobs offered Xerox's venture division the opportunity to purchase 100,000 pre-IPO shares at $10 per share, a total of $1 million. In exchange, Xerox would open PARC's laboratories to Apple's engineering team. What Xerox received was a financial position in a promising startup. What Apple received was the architectural blueprint of the entire digital future, demonstrated in real time by the people who had assembled it. 13 months later, when Apple went public on December 12, 1980, the stock closed near $29 per share. Xerox's $1 million stake had multiplied overnight. It remains, in the annals of corporate negotiation, one of the most lopsidedly consequential exchanges in history. Xerox traded the future for a modest investment return. Apple traded a piece of paper for modern computing. What Jobs witnessed inside PARC detonated something beyond engineering inspiration. He saw the Alto's mouse navigate a graphical interface with a fluency that no keyboard command structure could approximate. He saw windows open and close on a bitmap display. He recognized, with the predatory certainty that defined his every competitive instinct, that the people who had built it had absolutely no idea what they were holding. Apple's team returned to Cupertino and subjected everything they had witnessed to the ruthless discipline of commercial productization. The Alto's mouse cost $300 to manufacture. Jobs demanded a redesign that cost $15 or less. The graphical interface was rebuilt around direct manipulation, intuitive for a person with no computing background whatsoever. In January of 1984, the Macintosh launched at $2,495, announced by the most celebrated television commercial in advertising history, and delivered the graphical personal computer to the world in a form that ordinary human beings could actually own. But the higher the ascent, the more devastating the collapse, and Apple's internal architecture was already fracturing. The power struggle between Jobs and CEO John Sculley became a boardroom war. In 1985, the board stripped Jobs of his operational authority. He resigned. Exiled from the corporation he had co-founded, the man who had executed the most consequential heist in technological history departed into the California wilderness. Apple spent the following decade in systemic, progressive collapse, hemorrhaging market share, product coherence, and organizational identity, until, by the mid-1990s, it stood months from insolvency. Yet here lies the grand corporate plot twist, the recursive, almost operatic irony that history reserved for this story. In 1997, Apple acquired Next, the company Jobs had built during his exile, for $429 million. The acquisition returned Jobs to the corporation as an advisor, then as interim CEO, then as its permanent, unchallenged sovereign. In the year of his return, he struck a deal with Microsoft, Apple's most consequential rival, securing a $150 million investment and a commitment to maintain the Office suite on Macintosh. The company that had stolen the future from Xerox was now being kept alive by the company that had, in turn, appropriated the graphical interface from Apple. Every predator in this story met a predator larger than itself. Jobs alone survived them all. Fast forward to the modern era, and the empire he rebuilt from the ashes of his own exile now occupies a position in the global economy without historical precedent. Apple's market capitalization reached $3.77 trillion by the close of 2024, a number that exceeds the gross domestic product of virtually every sovereign nation on Earth. Its ecosystem generates not merely revenue, but dependency. a structural, total dependency that converts customers into permanent inhabitants of Apple's architecture, with walls too high and gates too familiar to consider departure. This was not accident. It was the deliberate construction of the most sophisticated consumer capture mechanism in commercial history, assembled on foundations that Xerox had built, abandoned, and surrendered for $1 million and a guided tour. Xerox today is a shadow entity with a market capitalization of approximately $300 million. Less than 1/10,000th of the corporation that entered its laboratories, witnessed its greatest achievements, and spent the following 4 decades building an empire on their bones. We are left with 2 irreconcilable visions of what this story means. The first is the one Silicon Valley prefers, the romantic narrative of visionary disruption defeating institutional paralysis, of hunger defeating complacency, of the garage defeating the laboratory. The second is the one the engineers at PARC carried with them for the rest of their lives, the vision of an institution so catastrophically incapable of understanding its own genius that it handed its most consequential inventions to a competitor for the price of a modest pre-IPO transaction, and watched, in slow and total silence, as that competitor built a civilization on their foundations. Jobs himself declared his philosophy with the clarity of a confession. "Good artists copy," he said in 1996. "Great artists steal, and we have always been shameless about stealing great ideas." He said it without apology. He said it as a declaration of principle, delivered by the man who had spent his entire career demonstrating that the greatest corporate weapon is not the capacity to invent. It is the capacity to recognize invention in the hands of those who do not know what they are holding, and to take it before they learn. Because sometimes, hidden behind the quiet elegance of a bitten apple, there is not just a product. There is a heist, conducted in broad daylight, with a handshake and a contract, against the most brilliantly gifted research institution in the history of the technology industry. A heist so audacious, so legally impeccable, and so catastrophically consequential that its victim continued, for decades afterward, to operate as a functioning corporation, without ever fully understanding that it had already been emptied.